Okay, so here's our third part in the photosynthesis lecture, and we want to continue this conversation about what happens with these electrons. So in the last part, we were talking about how the electrons get released from the reaction center. The sunlight excites them, they get shot up, they're captured by an electron acceptor, moved down the electron transport chain or electron transport system. As that happens, they drive ATP formation. The electrons then bounce up again and get caught by a second acceptor and moved over into the carrier molecule known as NADPH. Again, this is that little wheelbarrow that collects the electrons, and it will also be collecting hydrogen ions. So the challenge with the new non-cyclic system is that the electrons flow in one direction. They never circle back to go into the original electron or the original reaction center here. So there has to be a constant supply of new electrons. And this is again where water comes into the picture. So water, H2O, gets broken apart. It's a process known as photolysis, breaking apart water. And when you break apart the hydrogens from the oxygen, snap those bonds, then the electrons get released. Those will diffuse into the reaction center to replace the ones that have already gone through this process. Now, once you break apart water, you're left with hydrogens and oxygens. If the hydrogens are not collected, the pH of the cell, of the chloroplast, will start to become more acidic. So it's in the best interest to get rid of those hydrogens. Those hydrogens get moved into the NAD wheelbarrow here and attached. So now the wheelbarrow carries not just the electrons, but those extra hydrogens to prevent pH from decreasing and becoming more acidic. The oxygens, will those bond to each other? You have two oxygens that will bond, and now oxygen as a gas forms, and that diffuses out of the cell. So that is all part one, the light-dependent part of photosynthesis. You have to have sunlight, you have to have water, you have to have the little reaction centers in the chlorophyll for part one to occur. As it moves to part two, the process moves into the stroma of the chloroplast where there is no need for light. So this is why it's referred to as the light-independent portion of photosynthesis. So this is all happening in between the stacks of coins. So there's no need for sunlight here. So what we'll see happen is the first phase of the light-independent portion occurs when carbon dioxide is fixed into what's known as the Calvin cycle, or you'll see it called the Calvin-Benson cycle. So carbon dioxide up here becomes attached to this carrier and this molecule up here known as RUBP. I'm not worried about you guys knowing each of these intermediate steps here. Don't focus on that. That is not what we're going to focus on. My concern is carbon dioxide goes in, it gets reduced, and then it regenerates as RUBP. And as it does this, the most important thing to think about or look at is carbon oxygen in the form of carbon dioxide goes in. As the wheel turns, it uses ATP, and that came from the light independent portion, because if you remember the first part, it was making ATP. The NADPH, the wheelbarrow, comes over and dumps off its hydrogens and electrons. So now you have carbon, oxygen, hydrogens, and energy. Take that, reassemble those elements together, and now it forms a little thing called glucose, C6H12O6. The wheel gets turned again, a little more energy needed for that, and it's ready to go a second time. So this will constantly be spinning and constantly turning as long as carbon dioxide becomes fixed, ATP turns the wheel, and NADPH drops the hydrogens into it. So the key is getting the ingredients in there, turning it, kind of like a big mixing bowl, turning all these ingredients, and then reforming it into different molecules. The in-goal molecule really to focus on here will be glucose. That is sugar. So here's a better version of it, a little more detail. Again, I am not going to ask you guys to worry about each of these individual steps. You'll get to do this in later courses. For me, focus on carbon dioxide goes in, ATP turns the wheel, NADPH drops off hydrogens, and in product, sugars. Officially, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, stick those together, you have glucose. Okay, so the two pathways are parallel to each other in somewhat the concept of step one, step two, what happens here, what happens there. But the most important thing to consider and to remember with these two pathways is that they feed each other. They supply each other the ingredients. So photosynthesis produces oxygen. That oxygen is essential for specifically aerobic respiration. The carbon dioxide from the aerobic respiration goes and fuels the photosynthesis process. The glucose produced in photosynthesis is one of the main ingredients in the key energy sources used in cellular respiration. So these two pathways are unbelievably connected. One does not work without the other. So we want to consider that when we look at life and think about all the things on the planet that are producers, how they need the consumers. And the consumers absolutely have to focus on how they require the producers for the oxygen and the sugars, the basic ingredients that they provide. But do keep in mind, it becomes a structural issue. If you have this structure, the chloroplast, and the structure, the mitochondria, in the same organism, you don't need a different organism, really. And when we look at a lot of the producers and different organisms out there, they contain both of these. Animals, well, we're stuck with just this one. Plants, they have both. Algae have both. A lot of different things have both of these. But some things like animals, fungi, we have just this one. So as we look at a larger species picture, animals are dependent upon plants for survival. Plants are not necessarily dependent upon animals. Okay, so things we'll talk about later as we continue through the evolution units. Alright, so another key thing we want to take a look at is this structure called the stomata. Stomata are these tiny little pores or openings in plant leaves. The key function here for the stomata is to regulate gas exchange and try to minimize water loss. So it's this little slit here that creates an opening, and then it has these two guard cells surrounding it, one up here, one down here. And the guard cells respond to water levels. So if it's hot and dry, the guard cells swell up and they will actually squeeze close that little opening, kind of seal it off so nothing goes in, nothing goes out. During good conditions, the guard cell are relaxed and they're kind of pulled apart, and they leave that little slit there, that little opening that allows oxygen to diffuse in and out of the plant cells and the leaves of the plant, and then water to diffuse out. Water does not diffuse into the leaf. Water goes into the cells or into the plant through the root system. So with water, it's pretty much a one-direction flow of water, diffusion out of the leaf when there are dry or hot conditions. So stomata have become an essential structure in the plant cell for surviving bad environmental conditions like drought, heat stress, things like that. Okay. So when it gets hot and dry, and consider typical Illinois summers when we get up to 90 degrees or 100 degrees for 4 or 5 days in a row and there's no rain and just unbelievably hot and dry, plants go into what we call heat stress. For anybody in Illinois who has walked past a cornfield in July, all the leaves tend to be pointing upward instead of flat out, parallel to the ground. When they're going upward and they're kind of curling and getting smaller, That's heat stress. That is the plant indicating it doesn't have enough water and it is stressed. So what will happen here, the water is diffusing out of those leaves, and that's not a good thing for the plant, because if they can't draw in enough water through the root system, they're going to dehydrate. Water is essential for photosynthesis. You have to have it for stage 1, the light dependent, because the water busts apart, provides hydrogens, creates oxygen as a gas, but most importantly, water is the source of new electrons as the plants are going through photosynthesis. So under heat stress, the plants close those stomata in an effort to save water. So in an effort to save water, plants close the stomata. That is the key there. They're trying to close up those stomatas, keeping the water inside of the cells, keeping it inside the leaf tissues. Now, it's a good strategy to be able to save your water, but here's the big but. The concern here is, if you notice the little diagram on the right here, carbon dioxide can't get in. Oxygen's trapped inside. Now, for us, we think, well, that's a good thing, but that's not a good thing for plants. For photosynthesis to occur, the plant has to have carbon dioxide. It requires carbon dioxide to spin the Calvin-Benson cycle. We talked about a couple slides ago, carbon dioxide fixation. So if there's no carbon dioxide going into the leaf, there's no carbon dioxide going into the photosynthesis, into the Calvin-Benson cycle, that doesn't turn. It doesn't work. It shuts the pathway down. Oxygen being trapped inside the leaf is also a problem, because plants cannot use oxygen efficiently for photosynthesis. They try to shift over into a thing called photorespiration, but it's just not an efficient process. It does not work well at all for them to try to run an energy pathway with oxygen during trying to do this photorespiration pathway. So heat stress is a problem. Some plants are adapted to this. Other plants cannot adapt to it and do not survive. So what we're going to take a look at are different plant groups and look at how they've evolved in response to heat stress. That's probably one of the biggest issues, short of nutrients, lack of nutrients. Heat stress is probably the biggest issue a lot of plants face in certain environments. Obviously, if we're in a tundra environment, heat stress isn't much of an issue. But you think about the Midwest and equatorial regions and areas where plants are going to survive and try to grow in a limited amount of water with a dry environment, they have to be able to deal with this heat stress. And they've evolved different adaptations for it. Okay, so the first group of plants to mention are what we call the C3 plants. Now this is just category. It's not classification levels. It's not domain, kingdom, phylum, anything like that. It's just kind of a grouping of plants. These are plants that like spring and fall weather. They like it cool and somewhat moist in the spring, and then back to cool in the fall and somewhat moist in the fall. So think about Easter lilies in the spring and mums in the fall. These plants are specific to that type of temperature and moisture levels. Now the challenge with C3 plants is they don't do so well in heat stress. So you're not going to see your lilies doing really well in the middle of July and August. It's too hot, it's too dry. When they go into heat stress, they close up the stomata, they try to keep running photosynthesis, but the problem is they don't have a lot of carbon dioxide stored inside of their cells. They don't have any reserves of carbon dioxide, and that causes them to eventually open up those stomata, and now the plants, in a sense, are taking a breath and they lose their water, they dehydrate, and they tend to die when it gets too hot and too dry. So heat stress is not a good thing on C3 plants. They're great during spring and fall, but not during the middle of the summer.